YTEX ProTour Blue is my favorite string of all time. I've been playing with this since 2014, so that's 10 years. And it's the only poly I recommend because it's the only thing that's actually soft and comfortable, but it retains everything that makes polys good. And in my 10 years of playing with this, I've never come across anything that comes even close. As I alluded to in the thumbnail of this video, this for me is the one string to rule them all. In that time, I've also figured out that despite different string preferences amongst us tennis players, almost anyone can make use of ProTour Blue in some shape or form. And that's true whether you're a beginner or an advanced player or somewhere in between. So get comfortable and grab some popcorn because I'm going to cover all of that in this video. But first, fair warning, you're about to watch a grown man gush over essentially a piece of plastic. So we're going to use the power of video editing to cut me off whenever I start to go on and on and on and on. I bought ProTour Blue for a very silly reason. It's because I thought it would look good in this green and black Dunlop racket, which it did, but had I known the gem I was about to discover, I would have happily paid 10 times its price. I mean, don't tell my wife this, but I would consider making love to The best way I can describe this string is to say that it is soft and comfortable with amazing ball pocketing, but at the same time, it is lively, responsive, sufficiently crisp enough, and has amazing tension maintenance to boot. Like seriously, I've played with ProTour Blue for 15 hours straight, and by the time I cut it out, my tension meter gave me the same reading as it did at the end of my first session, which is crazy. Remind me, when was the last time you heard of a soft poly that held tension this well? Oh wait. Exactly. The first thing you'll notice with ProTour Blue is easy depth and deep, amazing ball pocketing, which is not surprising seeing that this is a soft poly, but the thing that surprised me is that it has none of the harshness that typically is associated with a poly. Now, I've always associated a lack of harshness with mutedness, but the thing that really impressed me was the fact that this string is definitely not a muted string. That's a good segue to talk about how ProTour Blue feels, because its crispness is pretty middle of the road. But despite that, this is the string that feels the best to me. I know what you're thinking. Aren't you the dude that said this? For me, a good feeling string is something that sends lots of vibrations down through the handle and into your arm. So think like a 9 out of 10 on a vibration score. The thing I don't believe I've ever explained fully is that vibration or crispness is not the only thing I look for when evaluating the feel of a string. If you watch enough of my videos, you know that the trait I look for the most from my setups is ball pocketing. And it's this interplay between ball pocketing and crispness that ProTour Blue balances better than anything else I've ever tried. Here's what I perceive and how I visualize it in my head. The deep ball pocketing means that the strings stretch more, right? That also means that the strings now have a larger distance to cover to return back to their starting position. So on softer strings, the impact duration is longer and the ball stays on your strings longer. This is fact and is known as impact duration or dwell time. This dwell time feels very generous on ProTour Blue. As the ball leaves, the string bed reverberates back into place. And when you combine this with the fact that the strings get stretched more and have longer to travel to return back to the starting position, it feels like these reverberations happen over a longer period of time. And because ProTour Blue is crispy enough, these reverberations come through. This is what makes the string feel so good. This combination of ball pocketing, dwell time, and crispiness gives me so much feedback that I feel like I have all the time in the world to direct the ball to exactly where I want it to go, and for it to take whatever trajectory I want it to take to get there. This pairs very nicely with my game, where my style is not to hit the crap out of the ball, rather it's to time it, and then to use the extending kinetic chain of my swinging motion to direct the ball where I want it to go. Basically, I've always appreciated people that make the game look easy, like Federer, and I like it when my equipment helps me do that naturally. But if you don't identify with this kind of a swing style, not to worry. I think ProTour Blue can work for everyone in some shape or form. While it suits these long stroke styles, it can also work for people who swing hard and fast, so think like Rublev. But that's because of the string's responsiveness. To me, responsiveness is just a measure of how quickly a string returns back to its starting position after being stretched by a ball. Stiff strings are naturally like this because they don't deform that much to begin with, but this trait is extremely hard to find in soft strings. This is why so many soft strings can feel mushy. ProTour Blue is like those stiff strings because it feels like it returns to its starting position very quickly, but it gives you a whole host of other advantages like comfort and power that I feel other strings that are stiff don't. The only real con is that although spin generation is what I would call good enough for a round poly, it's definitely not as good as it is with Zelenko Outlast, for example, and it's definitely not as elite as it is with ReString Sync. This, I think, comes down to the fact that it's soft string, so it notches very easily, in the same realm as Hyper-G, just as an example, but Hyper-G feels way stiffer than ProTour Blue. ProTour Blue makes up for this with easy power and depth, which is how it provides balance to good enough levels of spin generation. And it's only after you play with a balanced setup that does everything to a good enough standard is when you realize how important that balance is. With ProTour Blue, I've never had to think about my swing, or my tension, or whether the string pairs well with the racket or not. None of these details matter because it just works. It's a moment of absolute clarity where it's just you and your opponent and your effort in trying to get the ball to bounce twice before your opponent can get to it. It's a religious experience, like that essay by David Foster Wallace about Federer, where he talks about. I want to take a moment to talk about spin generation because I feel that's an important thing to consider when optimizing your setup. I find I'm starting to prefer round strings because with shape string my focus becomes too heavy on spin, and with that kind of focus I find I start hitting thin balls. What are thin balls? Well, they're the opposite of heavy balls, the ones that really good players can hit, the ones that jump up and away from you. So when you hit thin balls, you may get lots of spin, but that spin doesn't translate into as much trouble for your opponent as it potentially could. Maybe it's just me, but I always love it when I play opponents who hit these kinds of thin balls. They're really easy to deal with. I either just step in to take the ball early and put my opponent under pressure right away, or I step back and wait for the ball to come to a comfortable height. And in doing so, I tend to get time to disguise my shot to send my opponents the wrong way. So while maximizing spin is a completely legit strategy, especially if you want to play that way, I would still encourage you to have a balanced setup so you don't sacrifice something else in pursuit of maximizing spin. I can think of no better string to do that with other than ProTour Blue, especially if you want to play with a full bed of poly, and especially if you play at the intermediate level. But remember I said ProTour Blue is for everyone? Let's talk about what you can do if you find yourself in the advanced or the beginner camp. I still remember the first time I tried hybrids. It was these two from Zelenko. So Tourbite crossed with Vanquish, which is a multi, and Outlast crossed with ProStack, which is a nylon. I bought these because they had been conveniently packaged up for me and I didn't have to think about how to pair two different strings together. And it was a revelation. These felt so good. And yes, I have reviewed them on my channel. You'll find the link down in the description below. I actually ended up collabing with Kent from the channel Open Court, and he's someone who tends towards stiffer setups. So the idea was you would get a very balanced take because his take would counter mine that tends to softer strings. Here's what I had to say in that video. I do think for a lot of kind of average Joes, like people like me who are like fit, athletic, but you know, we're idiotic enough to think more highly of ourselves than we generally should, you know, because we're not pro players. I think it's for people like us because I can see myself using Tourbite's potential, but I don't think my body is capable of handling that abuse day in, day out. For people, idiots like me, I think this is fantastic, you know?
Yeah.
I've now come to believe that for most of us novices who are not advanced players, hybrid setups are the way to go, with the stiffer strings in the main and the softer strings in the crosses. They truly give you the best of both worlds. But advanced players should also consider them. The best and the greatest have played with hybrid setups. Federer, Djokovic, Murray all have played with gut poly hybrids. That is really just an acknowledgement of not only the pros of polys, which is their amazing spin and control, but also their cons, which is their stiffness and harshness. I've always thought it's a shame that manufacturers haven't been able to bring the price of gut down over time. I hit with it in both a full bed and hybrid setups a long time ago, and I knew right there and then that no synthetic material would ever match it. So the challenge for me has always been to replicate that feeling. A poly cross with a synthetic gut or multi as with these hybrids has always been the default choice, and as good as these setups are, I have to acknowledge that there is a durability downside, and no advanced player is ever going to make that sacrifice. In my view, ProTour Blue as a cross is what fills that gap, so much so that I call it the new synthetic gut for advanced players, because its performance is leagues ahead of anything I've ever come across, especially with its tension maintenance. And I want to remind you, this is a poly, so its durability is so much better. Let me give you a concrete example. This is ReString Sync, which I just reviewed pretty critically on my channel. And my main complaints here were the fact that its stiff, low-powered nature clashed pretty strongly with its round shape. and that it played more muted than I would have preferred. Here's what I had to say in that video. Zero is geared towards advanced players that swing hard and fast, want to rail on the ball from the baseline, use spin to keep the ball inside the court, and want to keep doing that without a fear of loss of performance due to a decrease in snapback or tension loss. That represents a big chunk of players. But the only change I would make to this sentence with sync is this underlined bit to attack the ball and come in, because I can see that this caters to a more attacking style of play, but at the same time, this doesn't have the power or feel I would think someone would need from a setup for that. To me, an attacking style of play focuses on keeping points short, but the stiff, controlled nature of sync only helps with keeping balls inside the court, not much else. To attack with this, you really have to go after your shots, which takes effort and negates the effort savings you get from keeping points short. So who is this for? Alcaraz? One of my first hybrid experiments with sync was ProTour Blue crossed with sync. I'll get to why it's not the other way around in just a bit, but that setup solved every problem I had with sync, other than its mutedness, which, although much better, was still a bit too much for me. I'm not the target demographic for sync to begin with, but you can hand me that setup any day of the week, and I could have a satisfying session with it. ProTour Blue cross with sync is still on the control side of the spectrum, but now I can attack the ball and finish points off at the net without feeling the need that I have to muscle every ball in order to do so. I also got much better spin than I did with a full bed of ProTour Blue, on the same level as a full bed of Solenko Outlast, and this is why I crossed ProTour Blue with sync. My thought process was that sync is slipperier and stiffer than ProTour Blue, so it would resist notching much better than the other way around. And I didn't test sync cross with ProTour Blue, but based on what I saw, I think my reasoning was sound. If you're in the beginner camp, I wouldn't change that much. Just cross ProTour Blue with a synthetic gut or multi, or the other way around. I experimented with ProTour Blue crossed with my favorite synthetic gut, which is the Gosen OG Sheep Micro, and it played uber soft and comfortable. And if you're someone who has niggling injuries or some elbow, shoulder, or wrist pain, I cannot think of a better setup to recommend. That ProTour Blue and Sheepy setup did play a bit on the muted side for me, which just adds more fuel to this theory I've had for a while that soft strings don't pair well with other soft strings, but I think the caveat is that that's racket dependent. There's more I have to say on that, so stay tuned, but in the meantime, like I said, if you're a beginner or you have some niggling injuries, there's no better setup, just go with that. Another more crisper option for a nylon cross is Prince Lightning Pro. I haven't tested it with ProTour Blue, I've only tried it in a full bed, so if you happen to take up my recommendation and try it with ProTour Blue, please let me know down in the comments below, I'm genuinely curious. So yeah, that's ProTour Blue, my favorite string. Hopefully this encourages you to give it a try, especially if you're looking for a softer option. There's only one other review of the string on YouTube, and that's by my friend Kent from the channel Open Court. I think his reviews are very fair and very good, so I highly recommend you go watch it. I'll link it down in the description right below the like and sub button. Okay, see you in the next one. I know what you're thinking. What's this hybrid?